in 1985, when three young brothers vanished into thin air, leaving behind only heartbreak and a gaping void. For 30 long years, the mystery lay dormant, a cold case gathering dust. But a single, overlooked detail in an old photograph, a fleeting glimpse of crimson, would ignite a spark, threatening to expose a truth far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Enjoying the suspense? Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what you think might have happened. The Oregon summer sun, usually a welcome caress, felt oppressive as it beat down on the manicured lawns of the Petersons' backyard. Eleanor Vance, a woman whose 62 years were etched not unkindly around her eyes, but more deeply in their haunted depths, adjusted the brim of her wide sun hat. She watched the neighborhood children, a kaleidoscope of bright summer clothes and shrill laughter, darting around the adults at young Timmy Peterson's 8th birthday party. Her gaze, as always, lingered a moment too long on any group of 3 boys, a reflex ingrained by 3 decades of loss. Arthur, her husband, 2 years her senior and her steadfast anchor through the unending storm, was by the barbecue, his laughter a low rumble as he chatted with Tom Peterson. They'd arrived an hour ago, a familiar ritual in this tight-knit community where joys and sorrows were shared like cups of sugar. The birthday song had been sung, its cheerful notes a stark contrast to the perennial ache in Eleanor's chest. Cake, a lurid blue confection, had been distributed, and now a comfortable lull had settled as children played and adults nursed their lemonade. Eleanor was only half listening to Martha Jennings drone on about her prize-winning roses when a movement at the patio door snagged her attention. A man she didn't recognize, tall and with a nervous energy about him, stepped into the yard. He was holding the hand of a small boy, perhaps 7 or 8, whose dark, unruly curls bounced with every step. "Sorry we're late," the man announced, his voice a little too loud, addressing no one in particular. Bit of a kerfuffle at home. The boy, as if released from a spring, instantly broke free from his father's grip and bolted towards the other children, a blur of motion. As he ran past Eleanor, a shock, cold and electric, jolted through her. He wore denim overalls, a distinctive forest green, with bright sunshine yellow straps crisscrossing his back over a simple, long-sleeved white shirt. His dark curls, so like... Eleanor froze. Her breath hitched. The combination, the green, the yellow, the dark, rebellious hair. It was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The world around her, the cheerful chatter, the scent of grilled burgers, receded into a dull roar. Without a word of apology to a bewildered Martha, Eleanor moved. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence in her ears. She crossed the yard with a speed that belied her age, her eyes locked on the small figure now attempting to join a game of tag. She reached out, her hand trembling, and grasped his small shoulder, gently but firmly turning him to face her. "Where?" she began, her voice a raw whisper, barely audible even to herself. "Where did you get those clothes?" Her other hand rose, unbidden, to hover near his dark, springy hair. It was an instinctive gesture, one she'd performed countless times on 3 identical heads. The boy's eyes, wide and hazel, flew open in alarm. He recoiled as if stung, twisting away from her touch with a cry. "Daddy! Daddy!" he shrieked, his voice high-pitched with fear, as he scrambled back towards his father. The man, Rowan, as Eleanor would later learn his name, looked up, his brow furrowing in concern. He immediately strode towards Eleanor, who stood rooted to the spot, a tremor running through her. His son clung to his leg, peering out fearfully. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Rowan asked, his tone more curious than accusatory, but a protective arm was already around his son. His body language, however, was a clear shield. She touched me," the boy whimpered, pressing his face into his father's jeans. "She scared me." Rowan's expression hardened, a subtle shift from concern to suspicion. "What's going on here? Why did you grab my son?" Eleanor's mouth worked, but no sound emerged. Her gaze was still fixed on the boy's overalls. She reached out again, her fingers stopping just short of the denim. "Those clothes. Where?" "Excuse me?" Rowan stepped squarely between Eleanor and his son, Malachi. "What's your problem, lady?" His voice was sharper now, drawing the attention of nearby guests. Arthur materialized at Eleanor's side, his presence a familiar comfort. Several neighbors, their conversations interrupted, began to drift closer. sensing the rising tension. Arthur wrapped a supportive arm around Eleanor's shoulders, his eyes quickly assessing the scene. He felt the slight, almost imperceptible tremor that always accompanied her deepest distress. "I'm so sorry," Arthur said, his voice calm and steady, though Eleanor felt the slight tremor in the hand on her shoulder. "My wife, she didn't mean any harm." He looked at young Malachi, and Eleanor felt him stiffen, almost imperceptibly. "Your son's outfit?" he continued, his voice softer now. "It's remarkably similar to what our boys used to wear." A hush fell over the small knot of onlookers. "Our sons," Arthur explained, his gaze distant for a moment. "They were triplets. Ethan, Owen, and Liam. They went missing 30 years ago, back in 1985. They were wearing green denim overalls, just like those, with bright yellow straps, and long-sleeved white shirts. It must have been a shock for my wife to see them again, so unexpectedly." The neighbors murmured, a wave of understanding and renewed sympathy rippling through them. Mrs. Peterson, the party's host, stepped forward, her face etched with compassion. "It's true, Rowan," she said softly to the newcomer. "The Vance boys, it was a terrible tragedy. The whole town searched for weeks. They just vanished." Rowan's defensive posture visibly relaxed. The hardness in his eyes melted into something akin to pity. "Oh my goodness, I had no idea. I'm so terribly sorry." He looked down at Malachi's overalls. "These? I bought them a few months ago at a department store downtown. Miller's, I think it was. I can't recall exactly when." Eleanor, still visibly shaken but finding her voice, pleaded, "Please, could I just look at the label? The brand? I just want to see." Arthur gently squeezed her arm. "Eleanor, honey," he said, his voice low and soothing, "the boy isn't Ethan or Owen or Liam. Let's not upset him or his father any further." He turned back to Rowan. "Again, I sincerely apologize for my wife. This has, as you can imagine, been a difficult 30 years." Mrs. Peterson, ever practical, touched Eleanor's other arm. "Eleanor, dear, you look terribly pale. Perhaps you and Arthur should go home and rest. It's been a bit of a shock, I'm sure." Arthur nodded gratefully. "Yes, I think that's best. Thank you, Sarah." He thanked the Petersons again, excused themselves from the gathering with a polite nod to Rowan and Malachi. "I wish we'd met under better circumstances," Arthur said to Rowan. "I'm truly sorry for upsetting your wife," Rowan replied, his sincerity evident. "We're new to Willow Creek. Just moved in last month. Thought attending the party would be a nice way to meet everyone." "It's not your fault at all," Arthur assured him, already guiding a still trembling Eleanor out of the backyard. The familiar 3-block walk home felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of resurrected grief. The sight of those green overalls, a seemingly innocuous piece of clothing, had torn open wounds that, despite the passage of 3 decades, had never truly healed. They had only scarred over, thin and fragile, easily broken. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old books in their own living room did little to soothe Eleanor as Arthur gently guided her to the worn velvet sofa. He disappeared into the kitchen, the clinking of a mug and the hiss of the kettle, a comforting, domestic sound that barely penetrated her turmoil. When he returned with a steaming cup of chamomile tea, his hand steady as he helped her take a sip, Eleanor's composure finally crumbled. "I didn't mean to frighten that poor child," she choked out, tears welling and spilling down her cheeks. "It's just, when I saw those overalls, that specific green, Arthur, and the yellow straps." Arthur sat beside her, taking her trembling hand in his own. "I know, Ellie. I know. It was an anxiety attack. It's understandable." His voice was a low balm, but she could see the shadow in his own eyes. He, too, had seen the resemblance, however fleeting. "I can't forget them, Arthur," she whispered, the tears now streaming freely. "Even after all this time. 30 years. They'd be men now. 36 years old. Grown men." "I know," he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I feel so embarrassed," she continued, her voice thick with unshed grief and fresh mortification, "always dredging up the past, making everyone uncomfortable. That poor man Rowan and his little boy. We don't ever have to forget our sons, Eleanor," Arthur said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "And you have nothing to be embarrassed about. I was shocked, too, when I saw that boy's clothes. They were so incredibly similar. The green denim, the yellow straps, the long-sleeved shirt underneath. It was like seeing a ghost. Eleanor sat up a little straighter, a new resolve flickering in her tear-filled eyes. "I want to see their photos again, Arthur. The ones where they're wearing those exact overalls. I need to see them." Arthur hesitated. "Ellie, they're in the big cedar chest in the attic. We haven't opened it in, it must be over 20 years. Are you sure? Please," she implored, a desperate edge to her voice. Maybe it will help me calm down. To see the differences. To prove to myself it was just a coincidence." He sighed, a sound heavy with shared sorrow, but nodded. "All right, I'll get it for you." He rose, his movements a little stiffer than they used to be, and disappeared up the narrow attic stairs. Eleanor heard his footsteps creak across the floorboards above, then the groan of the old cedar chest's lid. Several long minutes later he returned, carrying a large, dust-covered wooden chest. He set it carefully on the coffee table, wiping the layer of dust from its carved lid with a nearby dish towel. Together, with a shared, unspoken reverence, they lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and mothballs, a fragrance of preserved childhood, wafted out, mingling with the dust motes dancing in the afternoon, sunbeams slanting through the window. One by one, they carefully removed the items, each handled as if it were the most fragile porcelain. 3 small worn baseball gloves, their leather softened with use. A collection of colorful chipped marbles. 3 identical threadbare teddy bears, their button eyes staring blankly ahead. Stacks of elementary school homework, adorned with gold stars and crudely drawn smiley faces from a teacher long since retired. Each object was a preserved fragment of their sons' truncated lives, a poignant reminder of futures stolen. "The photo album should be at the very bottom," Arthur said, his voice husky with emotion. "We packed it last, I remember." As they removed the final layer of carefully folded clothes, tiny t-shirts, miniature jeans, and 3 identical sets of pajamas, the worn, leather-bound album appeared. Arthur lifted it gently, its cover smooth and cool beneath his fingertips, a testament to years of handling before it had been consigned to the darkness of the chest. They settled side by side on the sofa, a familiar position of shared comfort, as Arthur opened the album. The first pages were a blur of joy. 3 identical newborns, swaddled in blue hospital blankets, 3 chubby toddlers taking their wobbly first steps, their faces alight with triumph. Birthday parties, where 3 sets of candles were blown out in perfect, gleeful synchronicity. "They were always so in tune with each other," Eleanor whispered, her finger tracing the outline of 3 small boys building an elaborate sandcastle at Cannon Beach, their tongues poked out in concentration. Arthur turned the pages slowly. Each image a portal to a cherished memory, a story recounted, a forgotten detail brought back to life. Then they reached it. The photograph. The triplets stood in a row in front of their old blue spruce tree, the one that had succumbed to blight a decade ago. They were grinning broadly, arms slung around each other's shoulders, a united front against the world. And they were wearing them. Forest green denim overalls with bright, sunshine, yellow straps pulled over long-sleeved white shirts. "This was taken the morning they disappeared," Arthur said softly, his voice thick. "Just an hour or so before they were gone." Eleanor nodded, leaning closer, her eyes scrutinizing every detail of the overalls. "Look, Arthur," she said, a new note in her voice, less grief, stricken, more analytical. "The boy at the party, Malachi. His clothes were similar, yes, but different. The shade of green in this photo is deeper, more of a true forest green. His was a bit brighter, more modern-looking. And look at the checkered pattern on our boy's straps. It's a very fine, almost invisible weave. His straps were plain yellow, I think." "And the stitching," Arthur noted, peering closely. "Ours had double stitching along the seams. His looked simpler. A similar concept, certainly, but definitely not the same garments. Not identical." Eleanor rubbed her tired eyes and sighed, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Relief that it wasn't an exact match, disappointment that there wasn't a more tangible link, and a fresh stab of guilt. "I feel dreadful about how I reacted. That poor child and his father. Rowan and Malachi, you said?" Arthur nodded. "They're new to Willow Creek," he mentioned. "Moved in about a month ago." "I should find them and apologize properly," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "I must have terrified that little boy." They continued to gaze at the photograph, their shared reminiscing a bittersweet balm. Arthur smiled as Eleanor recounted how Liam had insisted on wearing his overalls backward that morning until she'd patiently cajoled him into wearing them correctly, and how Owen had already managed to get a grass stain on one knee before breakfast, ever the little adventurer. Ethan, the quietest of the three, had simply watched his brother's antics with an old-soul wisdom in his eyes. As Arthur rose to refill his teacup, Eleanor suddenly gasped, poking his arm so sharply he nearly spilled the hot liquid. "Arthur, look, in the background! Zoom in if you can." "No, just look closely," she urged, her voice suddenly tight with an unidentifiable emotion. Isn't that the old crimson Cadillac? The one Ethan was so utterly obsessed with?" Arthur set down the teapot with a clatter and leaned over the album, his brow furrowed. There, partially visible at the very edge of the frame, almost blending into the shadows of the neighbor's overgrown hedge, was the unmistakable front fender and chrome grille of a vintage reddish-brown, almost crimson Cadillac. "You're right," he said slowly, a cascade of forgotten memories surfacing. Ethan was mad about cars, especially that one. The boys used to beg to look inside whenever they saw it parked down the street. "That's Mr. Silas Croft's Cadillac," Eleanor breathed, her voice growing more intense, a strange premonition coiling in her stomach. "Their third-grade teacher from Willow Creek Elementary. Remember how he rarely drove it? He told us it was his most prized possession, a family heirloom. Everyone in the school community knew about that car," Arthur agreed, nodding slowly. "The children thought it was the most magnificent machine they'd ever seen. Croft was a good man. The kids adored him." Eleanor turned the photograph over, searching for any forgotten notes on the back, then flipped it again, her gaze now laser-focused on that sliver of crimson. "Arthur," she said, her voice low and urgent, "are you absolutely, unequivocally sure this photograph was taken on the very day they disappeared?" "Positive," Arthur confirmed. "Why do you ask?" "Because," Eleanor said, her brow furrowing deeply, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud, "Mr. Croft had moved to a different town by then. Remember? All the parents were so sad when he announced he was transferring schools. The children loved him so much. We threw him a farewell party at the school. It was the week before the boys vanished." Chapter 3. A Faint Trail. Arthur frowned, his certainty momentarily shaken by Eleanor's conviction. "No, Ellie, I'm sure this was taken the morning they went missing. They disappeared in the afternoon after lunch. I remember developing this roll of film specifically because it was the last one with them on it." "But that's impossible," Eleanor insisted, her mind racing. "Mr. Croft had supposedly moved from Willow Creek a full week before the boys disappeared. So how could his Cadillac, his cherished Cadillac, be parked just down the street in this photograph on that specific day?" Arthur set the album aside and began to rummage through the cedar chest again, sifting through the items they had already examined. His hand paused on a small rectangular Kodak envelope, faded yellow with age, the film negative still nestled safely inside. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the printed information. "Look," he said, holding the envelope out for Eleanor to see. The processing date from the photo lab was stamped clearly on the outside, the 15th of June, 1985. This confirms it. The film was developed 2 days after they disappeared. These pictures were definitely taken that morning, the 13th of June. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill seeping into her bones, despite the warm afternoon air in the living room. "If that truly was Mr. Croft's Cadillac," she mused, her voice barely above a whisper, "then he might have seen something suspicious in the neighborhood that day. The police would have questioned him, surely." She paused, a new thought dawning. "But they never mentioned interviewing him, not once. Which means he must have genuinely been gone from Willow Creek before the boys disappeared, just like everyone believed." A knot of confusion tightened in her stomach. How could both things be true? Arthur, noticing Eleanor's increasing agitation, the telltale flush rising on her neck, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ellie, darling, it could be a coincidence. It might not even be Silas Croft's Cadillac. It was 30 years ago. Memories can play tricks. It could have belonged to anyone. But I don't remember anyone else in our neighborhood, or even in Willow Creek, who owned a Cadillac like that," Eleanor countered, her voice firm. "Especially not that distinctive crimson color. We were a very close-knit community back then, Arthur. We would have known." "Perhaps it didn't belong to a local," Arthur suggested, ever the voice of reason. It could have been a visitor, someone staying with one of the neighbors. You shouldn't torture yourself overthinking this, honey. The police, Detective Reynolds back then, they examined all our family photos, including this one. They questioned everyone, followed every conceivable lead. If it had been Mr. Croft's Cadillac, and if it was significant, they would have noticed the license plate, investigated it, and informed us. Eleanor took a deep, shaky breath as Arthur urged her to take another sip of tea. The warmth did seem to calm her slightly, or perhaps it was the soothing familiarity of his presence. "You're right," she conceded finally, though a sliver of unease remained. "It's probably nothing, just an old car, an old memory." Arthur nodded, a mask of relief settling over his features, and gently closed the photo album. Eleanor, however, had carefully removed the photograph of the triplets and the crimson fender, tucking it into the pocket of her cardigan. Together, they began to return the precious, painful mementos to the cedar chest, each item a fragment of the lives their sons had lived and the futures they were cruelly denied. After the last tiny sock was folded, and the heavy lid of the chest was closed once more, Arthur glanced at the ornate grandfather clock in the hallway. He jumped to his feet. "Good heavens, I've completely lost track of time. My checkup with Dr. Matthews is at 4:50, and it's already 4:30. It's Saturday. The clinic closes at 6 today." Eleanor looked up from where she sat, still cradling the photograph in her lap, surprised. "Oh, Arthur, I completely forgot to remind you. Doctor?" Matthews does get rather stern when patients are late. She quickly helped him gather what he needed, his health insurance card, the list of his current medications, and the small journal where he'd been diligently recording his blood pressure readings. Within 5 minutes, Arthur was ready to leave, car keys jangling in his hand. "Are you sure you'll be all right by yourself for a bit?" he asked, pausing at the door, his gaze lingering on her with concern. "I'll be fine," Eleanor assured him, forcing a smile. "I'll make some supper, maybe read a little. Don't worry about me, just focus on getting a good report from Dr. Matthews." Arthur nodded, leaned down to kiss her cheek, a gesture of 35 years of shared life, and hurried out to the car. After he left, the silence in the house seemed to amplify. Eleanor wandered into their bedroom and picked up her smartphone from the nightstand. A text message had arrived while they were lost in the attic's memories. It was from Louise Albright, an old friend who had worked at the Willow Creek School District Administrative Office for nearly 3 decades before retiring a few years back. "Annual School District Retiree Luncheon next month, Ellie. Hope to see you and Arthur there. We miss you both. No, Louise." Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the message, her thumb hovering over Louise's contact picture. Louise would have known Silas Croft professionally. She would have handled personnel files, transfer requests. She might have information about him, about his exact departure date, about where he'd supposedly transferred. A knot of unease tightened in Eleanor's chest. She didn't want to suspect Mr. Croft. He had been such a kind, dedicated teacher, a gentle soul, especially wonderful with children, her own boys included. Yet, she couldn't shake the strange, disquieting feeling that had settled over her since spotting that crimson Cadillac in the photograph. It was a tiny, dissonant note in the symphony of her grief. Impulsively, before she could second-guess herself, she tapped Louise's contact information and pressed the call button. "Eleanor, what a lovely surprise." Louise answered on the 3rd ring, her voice as warm and cheerful as ever. "Did you get my text about the luncheon?" "I did, yes, Louise. Walter and I will certainly try to make it," Eleanor said, her voice smoother than she felt. "How have you been? It feels like ages." They spent several minutes catching up, exchanging news about mutual friends, sharing updates about their respective aches and pains, the inevitable talk of grandchildren, a topic Eleanor always navigated with a carefully constructed smile. Finally, Eleanor steered the conversation, as casually as she could manage, towards her real reason for calling. "Louise, do you happen to remember a Mr. Silas Croft? He taught 3rd grade at Willow Creek Elementary back in the early 80s, maybe mid-80s? "Silas Croft? Of course I remember Silas," Louise exclaimed. "Such a talented, dedicated teacher. The children and parents absolutely adored him. A real loss when he left." "Do you know where he is now?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her tone light. "I remember he moved out of town, transferred to another school, I think. But I can't for the life of me recall exactly where he went." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Actually, Eleanor," Louise said slowly, a note of confusion in her voice, "I think you might have that a bit mixed up. Silas Croft never continued teaching, not in the public school system anyway. He never filed any transfer papers to another district, not in Oregon or any other state that I ever saw." Eleanor sat up straighter, her heart giving a sudden, hard thump. "He didn't? But, we had a farewell party for him at the school. He told everyone he was moving, taking a position at a school in a quieter, more rural district." "No, that's not quite how it happened, dear," Louise said gently. "Maybe he was just being a bit vague or making a bit of a joke when he said that. You know how Silas could be, a bit theatrical sometimes. From what I recall, and what little gossip trickled back through the grapevine years later, he moved to a rather remote area somewhere in eastern Oregon, near the Wallowa Mountains, I think, and started some sort of private, well, they called it a charity farm, for disadvantaged children, or immigrant children, something like that. A very noble endeavor, if a bit eccentric." "A farm?" Eleanor repeated, her mind reeling. This was not what she expected. "I always thought he'd moved to a different state to continue teaching." "No, nothing like that. As far as our records ever showed," Louise assured her. "Wait a moment. Someone mentioned the name of his place to me a few months ago at a bridge game. Let me think." Silence hummed on the line for a moment. "Ah, I remember now. It's called Croft Sanctuary for New Beginnings." Yes, that was it. Quite a mouthful. "Croft Sanctuary for New Beginnings?" Eleanor repeated, the name etching itself into her memory with chilling clarity. "Why all the sudden interest in old Silas, Eleanor?" Louise inquired, her curiosity piqued. Eleanor hesitated, the photograph of the crimson Cadillac burning a hole in her pocket. "Oh, no particular reason," she lied, hating the deception. I remembered he had that old crimson Cadillac, and I thought I saw a similar car in an old family picture. Just a bit of nostalgia, really." "Oh yes, he did have that beautiful Cadillac," Louise confirmed with a chuckle. "A real classic. But he rarely ever took it out for a drive, did he? Preferred his sensible little Ford Escort for daily travel. That Cadillac was his pride and joy, more of a showpiece than actual transportation, if I recall correctly." "Do you happen to remember exactly when Silas left Willow Creek?" Eleanor asked, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Was it definitely before June of 1985? Louise sighed. "Oh, Eleanor dear, it was so very long ago. 30 years is a lifetime. I really couldn't say for certain without digging through dusty archives, and I'm not even sure those specific records would still exist. Why the specific date?" Eleanor murmured something non-committal and, after a few more pleasantries, ended the call. Her hand was trembling as she set the phone down. A farm, a sanctuary, and a crimson Cadillac that was more of a showpiece that might have been parked just down the street from her house on the worst day of her life. Eleanor's fingers flew across the keyboard of her laptop, the name Croft Sanctuary for New Beginnings typed into the search bar. Her breath caught as a simple, slightly outdated website materialized on the screen. The homepage banner was a photograph of a rustic, sprawling farmhouse, nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills and distant, hazy mountains, likely the Wallowas Louise had mentioned. Below it, smaller images depicted smiling young men and boys, predominantly of Hispanic or Latino appearance, with dark hair and suntanned skin, engaged in various farming activities, tending to livestock, harvesting vegetables, mending fences. She navigated through the sparse photo gallery. Nothing looked overtly unusual or suspicious. In fact, the images portrayed what seemed to be a positive, nurturing environment. Silas Croft, if this was indeed his venture, appeared to be doing commendable work, providing opportunities and a safe haven for vulnerable youth. His About Us page featured a brief, somewhat vague biography mentioning his background as an elementary school teacher in a small Oregon town, and his lifelong passion for working with children. The farm's mission statement emphasized education, vocational training, emotional support, and creating pathways to success for immigrant and at-risk youth. Eleanor found the sanctuary's address, a rural route number in a county she barely recognized, deep in eastern Oregon. There was an email contact, but conspicuously, no phone number. She stared at the screen, the image of the smiling boys blurring with the memory of her own 3, their faces forever frozen at age 6. Could there be a connection? Was this all a wild, grief-fueled fantasy? Or was the crimson Cadillac in her photograph a genuine, terrifying link to something unimaginable? She glanced at the clock, 5:15 p.m. Arthur would be home from his appointment soon. She needed to talk to him, to show him what she'd found. The thought of driving all the way to Eastern Oregon, to this remote sanctuary, felt both reckless and overwhelmingly necessary. Perhaps she could show Mr. Croft the photograph, ask him directly if the Cadillac was his, if he remembered anything about that fateful June day. The innocence of the thought felt naive even to her. When Arthur returned an hour later, pronounced healthy by Dr. Matthews but advised to continue watching his salt intake, Eleanor was waiting for him, the laptop open on the kitchen table. She explained what Louise Albright had told her, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and dread, then showed him the sanctuary's website. "I want to go there, Arthur," she said, her gaze intense. "Tomorrow. I need to see it for myself. I need to talk to him." Arthur listened patiently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Ellie, I don't know about this," he said slowly, running a hand through his thinning silver hair. "I'm worried about you. You seem fixated on this Cadillac coincidence. It could be nothing, and Croft was always a good man." I know he was," she assured him, "and I don't want to overthink this or harbor baseless suspicions. He was always so kind, so gentle with the boys. The charity farm looks like a wonderful thing, truly. Perhaps it would just be nice to catch up with him after all these years, to see what he's made of his life." Her plea was genuine, yet underneath it lay a darker, more urgent current. Arthur sighed, seeing the unshakable resolve in her eyes. "All right, Eleanor," he conceded. "We'll go, but we should try to call him first, if we can find a number. Let him know we're coming. It's a long drive to just show up unannounced." "I couldn't find a phone number," Eleanor said. "Just that email address. I sent a message an hour ago explaining we were old acquaintances from Willow Creek and might be in the area, but they might not see it before we arrive." They agreed to leave early the next morning. The drive to Eastern Oregon would take at least 4, perhaps 5 hours. Eleanor packed a small overnight bag, just in case, her movements fueled by a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. Sleep that night was fitful, punctuated by fragmented dreams of green overalls and crimson cars. The landscape gradually transformed as they drove eastward the next day, the lush greenery of the Willamette Valley giving way to the drier, more rugged terrain of central and eastern Oregon. Suburban neighborhoods dissolved into sprawling ranches, then into increasingly remote farmland and vast expanses of sagebrush under a pale, wide sky. "Any response to your email?" Arthur asked, his eyes fixed on the ribbon of asphalt unwinding before them. "No, nothing," Eleanor replied, checking her phone for the 10th time. She pulled the photograph of the triplets from her purse, her thumb tracing the barely visible fender of the Cadillac. The image felt like a talisman, a key to a locked door. After what felt like an eternity, following the GPS directions on Eleanor's phone, they turned off the main highway onto a long, unpaved gravel road. A simple, hand-painted wooden sign, weathered by the elements, read, "Croft's Sanctuary for New Beginnings. Private property. Visitors by appointment." The driveway, rutted and dusty, wound its way for nearly a mile before opening into a clearing. A large 2-story farmhouse, painted a faded yellow, stood as the centerpiece, flanked by several sturdy barns, outbuildings, and what appeared to be long, low-slung dormitory-style structures. The air was still, the place eerily quiet. Only a few chickens pecked desultorily in the dirt near one of the barns. As they parked their sedan near the farmhouse and stepped out, stretching their stiff limbs, a young man emerged from the largest barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He was Hispanic, probably in his early 20s, with kind eyes and a polite, if reserved, demeanor. "Hello there," Arthur called out, offering a friendly wave. The young man approached them, a hesitant smile touching his lips. "Hello, can I help you?" His English was good, with only a slight accent. "We're looking for Mr. Silas Croft," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is this his sanctuary?" "Yes, this is Mr. Croft's place," the young man confirmed. "Do you have an appointment with him?" Arthur shook his head. No, not exactly. We're old friends, acquaintances really, from back when Mr. Croft was a teacher in Willow Creek. We sent an email to the address on the website, but we weren't sure if he'd received it. The young man's expression cleared slightly. Ah, the email. That's the old address. We've been trying to get the website updated. Mr. Croft isn't here right now, I'm afraid, he said, a note of apology in his voice. He and most of our senior staff and many of the older boys went to the Wallowa County Agricultural Fair today. There's a big auction, and we're also running a small stall to promote our charity program and sell some of our produce. Oh, Eleanor said, a wave of disappointment washing over her. She'd pinned so much hope on this visit, on seeing Croft. She turned slightly towards the car, ready to suggest they leave. Wait, Arthur said, placing a gentle hand on her arm. He turned back to the young man. Since we've driven all this way, would it be at all possible to just look around the farm a bit? We'd be very interested to see what Mr. Croft has built here. We always knew he had a big heart. The young man hesitated, clearly uncertain. Let me just check with Mr. Ramirez. He's the supervisor on duty today. One moment, please. He walked a short distance away, pulling out a battered-looking flip phone, and had a brief, quiet conversation in Spanish. When he returned, he was smiling more readily. Mr. Ramirez says it's fine. I'd be happy to show you around. My name is Mateo, by the way. For the next 30 minutes, Mateo led them on a tour of the property. He showed them the well-kept barns housing a few dairy cows, goats, and pigs, the stables with a half-dozen horses, and the extensive fields where rows of vegetables grew under the Oregon sun. Throughout the tour, he spoke with quiet pride about the Sanctuaries program, explaining how they helped immigrant and at-risk youth learn about agriculture, animal husbandry, and sustainable farming, all while providing them with education, counseling, and a supportive community. It all sounded incredibly noble. This is one of our special barns, Mateo said, as they approached a brightly painted structure, its exterior adorned with colorful, childlike paintings of animals and flowers. It's designed specifically for the younger children, the new arrivals. A place for them to play, get messy, and explore farm life in a fun, non-threatening way. Mr. Croft himself designed this program to introduce them gently. Inside, the barn was cooler, smelling of hay and paint. Several low tables were set up with various craft supplies, clay, colored paper, dried beans, and pasta shapes. A man was arranging these materials, his back to them. He appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with a thick mane of dark, curly black hair and fair skin that seemed incongruous with the sun-drenched setting. When he turned at their entrance, wiping his hands on a towel, Eleanor saw he had an unusually wide, bright smile, a smile that crinkled the corners of his strikingly blue eyes. Alias, these are friends of Mr. Croft, Mateo explained. They stopped by hoping to see him. The man, Elias, approached them, extending a paint-stained hand. I'm Elias. I coordinate the activities for the younger ones here. A pleasure to meet you. His voice was warm, his handshake firm. Arthur and Eleanor Vance, Arthur said, introducing them. Elias gestured to the materials he'd been arranging. I'm just preparing some demonstration activities. We have some potential donors and community partners visiting during the fair this week. We want to show them exactly how we engage the children here, spark their creativity. He moved around the tables with a practiced, almost graceful ease, explaining each station. I've been here a very long time myself, he added with a soft chuckle. Since I was 6 years old, actually. Mr. Croft, well, he rescued me, you could say. Took me in when I had nowhere else to go. Mr. Croft was a school teacher before this, in Willow Creek, Eleanor said, her gaze fixed on Elias, watching his movements, the way his hands gestured as he spoke. Our sons, they were his students. He always had a special way with children. He's a man with a truly noble heart, Elias agreed, his smile unwavering. They looked around the barn, taking in the children's artwork that covered one entire wall. A vibrant tapestry of crayon drawings, painted rocks, and more textured creations where leaves, oats, and even crushed eggshells had been pasted onto paper to create unique effects. Eleanor's gaze landed on one particular drawing, set slightly apart from the others, more meticulously crafted. It was a picture of a vintage crimson Cadillac, the car's curves and chrome details painstakingly rendered, its body decorated with tiny, colorful grains of rice glued precisely to the paper. The detail was impressive, almost obsessive. "That Cadillac," Eleanor said, her voice a little breathless as she pointed to the drawing. "I remember that car. It was Mr. Croft's treasure." Elias nodded, his smile widening with a hint of pride. "Yes, he still has it. It's kept in one of the garages. In fact, he took it out for a spin just this morning, for the trip to the fair. He likes to make an entrance." He looked at the drawing fondly. "Actually, that particular one is mine. I made it a while back, as an example to show the children some different techniques. That's why it's a bit neater than their more exuberant creations." He chuckled, gesturing to the more chaotic, charmingly messy artwork surrounding it. A strange, icy chill, sharp as a shard of glass, ran through Eleanor's body, a gust of cold wind across her sun-warmed skin. She stared at Elias more intently now, his dark, unruly curls so similar to the ones she remembered, his wide, infectious smile, the way his head tilted slightly when he was concentrating. An unsettling, deeply buried sense of familiarity stirred within her, a ghostly echo from a lifetime ago. Something about his mannerisms, the precise way he used his hands when he spoke, the slight inflection in his voice. Elias, noticing her fixed, intense stare, shifted uncomfortably, his smile faltering slightly. Is everything all right, ma'am?" Arthur, sensing the shift in Eleanor, the sudden tension radiating from her, placed a subtle, warning hand on her back. Yes, I'm fine," Eleanor said quickly, forcing a shaky smile. "I'm sorry. It's just all these wonderful children's crafts. They reminded me so much of my own boys when they were young." She hesitated, the question forming on her lips before she could stop it, a desperate, illogical leap. Do you have any siblings, Elias?" "Eleanor," Arthur murmured, his voice low and cautioning, the pressure of his hand increasing slightly on her back. Elias chuckled, though it sounded a little awkward now, his earlier ease gone. "Yes, I do actually. My brother. He's at the fair today with Mr. Croft, helping out at the stall." He glanced at a utilitarian watch on his wrist. "You should definitely check out the fair if you have the time. They're having a children's craft showcase later this afternoon, and I believe there's a livestock auction still to come." They thanked Elias for his time, a polite veneer over the turmoil churning within Eleanor. Mateo, their young guide, led them back towards the entrance of the property. As they walked, Eleanor glanced back once, her mind racing with impossible possibilities, questions she couldn't yet articulate, fears she dared not voice. The image of Elias, his curly black hair and wide smile, was seared into her brain. When they reached their car, they thanked Mateo again for the tour. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she fastened her seatbelt, her thoughts consumed by the man with the captivating smile who had been rescued by Silas Croft at the tender age of 6. 6, the same age her boys had been. Inside the car, Arthur started the engine and consulted the GPS on his phone. "The Wallowa County Fairgrounds are only about 20 minutes from here, according to this," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Should we go?" "Absolutely," Eleanor replied, her voice tense with an almost unbearable mixture of dread and a fragile, terrifying hope. "I need to speak with Mr. Croft, and I need to see Elias's brother." As they drove down the dusty country road, the silence in the car was thick with unspoken thoughts. Arthur finally broke it, glancing at his wife, his brow furrowed with concern. "Eleanor, why did you ask Elias such a personal question about whether he had siblings? And you were staring at him so intently." Eleanor stared out the window, watching the arid farmland roll by in a blur. I had this strange, overwhelming feeling when I saw that Cadillac drawing he made. And then, his hair, Arthur, and that smile. The way he tilts his head." She turned to face him, her eyes pleading for understanding. He reminded me so much of Ethan." Arthur shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of pity and gentle exasperation. "Eleanor, darling, you can't possibly think that. Well, there might be a superficial resemblance, curly dark hair, perhaps a similar smile, but that doesn't mean Ethan would be 36 now. Elias looked to be in his late 30s, perhaps early 40s, it's true, but— I know, Eleanor interrupted, her voice tight with frustration. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be inappropriate. It's just, something about him felt so incredibly familiar, like a forgotten song you suddenly hear a few notes of. Arthur reached over and patted her hand reassuringly, but said nothing more. The rest of the short drive passed in a heavy silence, both lost in their own swirling thoughts, Eleanor's bordering on the fantastic, Arthur's on the pragmatic and worried. They arrived at the Wallowa County Fairgrounds to a cacophony of sounds and smells. Colorful tents and bustling booths lined the perimeter of a large, sun-baked field. Farm equipment, gleaming and monstrous, was displayed in the center. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn, cotton candy, livestock, and diesel fumes. The place was crowded, weathered farmers in overalls and seed caps, ranchers in cowboy hats and dusty boots, families with excited children clutching balloons and sticky treats. No auction happening right now, it seems, Arthur observed, checking a large schedule posted near the main entrance. Looks like the main livestock auction finished an hour ago. There's a youth craft showcase, starting in about 30 minutes on the community stage. They began to walk through the fairgrounds, their pace slow, Eleanor's eyes scanning every face, every booth. They stopped occasionally to look at displays of prize-winning pies, giant zucchinis, and meticulously groomed livestock, but Eleanor's focus was elsewhere. She was searching for a sign, a banner, a familiar face. After about 10 minutes of aimless wandering through the throng, they spotted it. A modest white tent, tucked away between a bustling corndog stand and a display of handmade quilts. A simple blue banner was stretched across the top, proclaiming in neat white letters, "Croft Sanctuary for New Beginnings, Cultivating Hope." As they approached, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. There, standing just inside the tent, engaged in animated conversation with a well-dressed couple who appeared to be potential donors or supporters, was Silas Croft. Though 3 decades had undeniably passed, she recognized him immediately. His once dark hair had thinned and gone completely white, framing a face now deeply etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and time. He was a little stooped, his frame frailer than she remembered, but he still possessed that same enthusiastic, almost theatrical way of gesturing as he spoke, his hands painting pictures in the air. He was older, yes, but unmistakably Silas Croft. They waited, hearts pounding in a strange, discordant rhythm, until the couple moved on, smiling and shaking Croft's hand. Then, taking a deep, steadying breath, they stepped forward. "Mr. Croft," Arthur said, his voice polite but firm. "Silas Croft?" The older man turned, his expression initially polite but blank, the look of someone used to meeting many new faces. "Yes? Can I help you?" You probably don't remember us, Mr. Croft," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it even. "I'm Eleanor Vance, and this is my husband, Arthur. Our sons, Ethan, Owen, and Liam. They were your students at Willow Creek Elementary, back in 1985. Silas Croft's brow furrowed as he studied their faces, his gaze moving from Eleanor to Arthur and back again. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his pale blue eyes. Vance, he murmured, tapping his temple lightly. "I'm terribly sorry. It's been such a long time, and I'm an old man now, nearly 75, can you believe it? The memory, it fails a bit more each year, I'm afraid." He gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle. Eleanor stepped a little closer, her gaze unwavering. "I helped organize your farewell party, Mr. Croft, with the other mothers from your 3rd grade class, before you left Willow Creek Elementary. If there was ever a woman constantly trailed by 3 identical little boys, like a mother duck with her ducklings, it was me, Eleanor Vance." Recognition, slow and hesitant at first, then more certain, dawned in Silas Croft's eyes. His face, which had been a polite mask, broke into a wider, more familiar smile. The charming, engaging smile they remembered so well. "Of course, the Vance family, Eleanor, Arthur, and little Ethan, Owen, and Liam. Bright boys, all 3 of them. So full of life, so inquisitive." His smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "My goodness, it is truly a surprise to see you both after all these years, a very pleasant surprise." "We were surprised to learn about your sanctuary, Mr. Croft," Arthur said, keeping his tone neutral. "We visited earlier today. It's quite an impressive operation you've built here." "Thank you, Arthur," Croft replied, his smile returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes now. "It's been my life's work, these past decades. A calling, you might say." The conversation, inevitably, awkwardly, shifted to the triplets. Croft's expression grew appropriately somber. I heard about the boys going missing, of course." "A terrible, terrible tragedy. I was deeply saddened, truly devastated, when I learned of it sometime after I'd left Willow Creek. Such a loss. We always thought you'd moved to another town, perhaps in a different state, to continue teaching," Eleanor said, watching his reaction with an intensity that made her own skin prickle. Croft shook his head slowly, his gaze distant. No, I stayed in Oregon. I did move to a different town for a while to complete some further certifications and prepare for this new venture." He gestured vaguely around the fairgrounds. "Starting this sanctuary. This was always my true dream, my ultimate calling." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, the photograph in her pocket feeling suddenly heavy. "Mr. Croft, do you happen to remember the exact date you left Willow Creek? Was it before or after our boys disappeared, on the 13th of June, 1985? "Before," Croft said promptly, without a moment's hesitation. "It must have been before. Yes, distinctly before. Otherwise, the police would certainly have questioned me as part of their investigation, wouldn't they? Being their teacher and all?" He tilted his head, a flicker of something. Curiosity? Suspicion? In his pale eyes. "Why do you ask such a specific question after all this time?" Without answering, Eleanor reached into her purse and produced the faded photograph. She held it out to Silas Croft, her hand remarkably steady. "I was looking at this old photograph just this morning, Mr. Croft. It was taken the very day the boys disappeared. Just an hour or so before, actually." Her finger, trembling almost imperceptibly, pointed to the crimson sliver at the edge of the frame. "I noticed this car in the background." Arthur stepped closer, his presence a silent support. "Was that your crimson Cadillac, Mr. Croft? Do you remember driving in our old neighborhood or perhaps parking near our home on that particular day?" Silas Croft's expression changed, subtly but undeniably. The affable, charming smile vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped seriousness. His eyes, which had been crinkling at the corners, now seemed to harden, becoming opaque and unreadable. He stared at the photograph for a long, silent moment, his gaze fixed on that damning splash of crimson. The sounds of the fair, the distant call of a barker, the laughter of children, the tinny music from a nearby carousel, seemed to fade into a dull, expectant hum. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than before, almost gravelly. I can't recall exactly the date when I finalized my departure from Willow Creek. It was a hectic time, and I certainly don't recall driving near your home or seeing the boys on that specific day." He handed the photograph back to Eleanor, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, cold moment. "That car, it must belong to someone else, a visitor perhaps. As I said, my memory isn't what it used to be." Arthur nodded, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Well, Mr. Croft, thank you for your time. At least now we have our answer." Eleanor nodded too, but she saw the almost imperceptible shift in Arthur's demeanor. He seemed suddenly tense, clearing his throat unnecessarily, his weight shifting from one foot to the other. He knew, just as she did, that Croft was lying. Croft looked at them, his expression now carefully neutral, almost bland. Do you think that Cadillac is somehow connected to your boy's disappearance?" "We're not sure, Mr. Croft," Arthur replied, his voice even. "The police never mentioned it back in 1981. We just happened to notice it in the photograph this morning. A strange coincidence, I suppose." Croft glanced at his watch, a sudden air of briskness about him. "Well, it's nearly 4:30. We need to start wrapping things up here at the stall. The fair officially ends at 5. He turned to two young men who had been quietly arranging pamphlets behind a display table, their faces impassive. "Let's get everything packed up and ready to load." He turned back to Eleanor and Arthur, his smile a thin, dismissive curve. "You should take the opportunity to look around the rest of the fair while you still can. In about 5 minutes, there will be a closing performance by the children from our sanctuary on the community stage. It's quite charming. You might enjoy it." He pointed towards a small, slightly dilapidated outdoor stage at the far end of the fairgrounds. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," Arthur said. "It was illuminating to see you again." As they walked away from the tent, a chilling premonition settling deep in Eleanor's bones, she lagged slightly behind Arthur. She heard Silas Croft's voice, low and urgent, speaking into a mobile phone he'd pulled from his pocket. "He needs to leave immediately after the performance. Get Oscar down here to help. Yes now, no delays." Eleanor froze, then slowly turned back. Croft was already busy directing his staff, his back to them, paying them no further attention. She hurried to catch up with Arthur, her mind a maelstrom of terrifying questions and a growing, sickening sense of dread. Oscar. That must be Elias's brother. They made their way towards the small outdoor community stage, the jaunty music from a nearby polka band doing little to lift the oppressive weight that had settled over Eleanor. A group of children, mostly of Hispanic descent, ranging in age from about 6 to perhaps 12, was assembling on the simple wooden platform. A woman with a guitar was attempting to organize them into rows. Eleanor watched the performance, a medley of cheerful folk songs sung in Spanish and slightly accented English, but her mind was elsewhere. Her eyes scanned the periphery of the crowd, the staff members from various booths who were beginning to pack up looking for anyone unusual. She was acutely aware of Silas Croft's tent, visible in the distance, where his young men were now efficiently dismantling the display. After a few minutes, a movement at the edge of the stage, near the tattered backstage curtain, caught her eye. A man emerged, walking with a swift, purposeful stride towards the vendor area, heading in the direction of Croft's tent. His pace was quick, almost hurried, as if on an urgent errand. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see his thick, unruly dark curls, almost identical to Elias's. "Arthur?" she whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve, her heart leaping into her throat. "Look, that man," she pointed discreetly. "The one walking so fast, over by the quilting booth. See his hair? Doesn't he look just like Elias from the sanctuary?" Arthur followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the retreating figure. The man was now passing a brightly lit stall selling artisan honey, his profile briefly illuminated. "Yes," Arthur said slowly, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The resemblance is striking. The build, the hair. It could be his twin." "Do you think?" Eleanor began, her voice tight with a barely controlled, terrifying excitement. "Do you think that's Oscar? The brother Elias mentioned? The one Croft was calling for?" Before Arthur could answer, Eleanor was already moving, slipping away from the thinning crowd around the stage, weaving between spectators and half-packed stalls to get a better look, to see his face. Arthur hurried after her, his longer strides easily keeping pace. They circled around a cotton candy vendor, its cloying sweetness suddenly nauseating, positioning themselves behind a large display of prize-winning jams and jellies where they could observe Croft's tent without being too obvious. The man with the curly dark hair had reached Silas Croft's tent. He was now engaged in an intense, low-voiced conversation with Croft himself. As they watched, hidden by a pyramid of strawberry preserves, the man turned slightly, giving them a clearer view of his profile, then a near full-face view as he gestured emphatically. Eleanor gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Arthur let out a small, involuntary sound beside her. The resemblance to Elias was not just striking, it was uncanny. They could have been identical twins. The same wide, engaging smile, though this man's smile seemed a little more reserved, perhaps a touch more wary. The same thick, expressive eyebrows. The same animated way of gesturing with his hands while speaking. He even had a similar way of tilting his head when listening intently to Croft. "This must be the brother Elias mentioned," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oscar, the one Croft was calling for. Arthur. They look like Ethan and Owen." Arthur's face had gone pale, his usual ruddy complexion bleached to a sickly gray. The confident skepticism he'd displayed earlier had vanished, replaced by a look of dawning horror and disbelief. "The smile," he murmured as if to himself, "the same curly black hair. Eleanor, could they be Lucas and Noah?" Eleanor finished, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words, using their sons' middle names, the ones they'd always intended to be their primary names if they hadn't been a match set. She gripped Arthur's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Remember how Liam, Gabriel, always had a slightly smaller build, his eyes a fraction smaller? He was always the easiest to identify because of that subtle difference in his eyes, a little more almond-shaped. And Owen, Noah. He had that slightly thicker brow, and he was always so agile and fast, even though he was generally calmer than Ethan and Liam. They watched, frozen in a state of horrified fascination, as Croft and the man, Oscar, it had to be, suddenly broke off their conversation. Croft gestured sharply, a commanding, almost impatient movement, and both men began walking rapidly towards the fairground's main parking area, leaving the other young staff members at the tent looking confused and uncertain. "Why are they in such a rush?" Eleanor's voice rose with a sudden sharp alarm. "Arthur, we have to follow them. I need to talk to that man, to Oscar." She started forward, ready to abandon their hiding place. But Arthur caught her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Eleanor, wait," he hissed, his eyes darting around. "We could be mistaken. It could still be a coincidence, however unlikely it seems. If they really are our boys, then Liam, Gabriel, he should be here too, or accounted for. Let's check this area first. If Gabriel is here somewhere, then we can call the police. We need to be smart about this, not just rush in." Eleanor hesitated, torn between the desperate urge to confront them and the terrifying logic of Arthur's words. She nodded reluctantly, her gaze still fixed on the rapidly retreating figures of Croft and Oscar. "You're right. Besides, we know where the sanctuary is if we need to go back there." They moved quickly, almost running, back through the thinning crowds of the fairgrounds, their eyes scanning every face, looking behind booths and tents, their hearts pounding in unison. They searched for a third man, one who might resemble Elias and Oscar, perhaps with those slightly more almond-shaped eyes that had distinguished their Liam. But they found no one. The fair was emptying out, vendors packing up, families heading home. Maybe we're wrong," Arthur said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. The sight of Oscar, so undeniably similar to Elias, had shaken him to his core. But Eleanor was already heading back towards Silas Croft's tent, a determined, almost feral look on her face. A single staff member was still there, an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with weathered hands and a deeply lined face that spoke of decades of outdoor work. He was methodically folding up the blue banner. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice casual, though it quivered slightly. "We were just at the sanctuary earlier today and met a wonderful young man named Elias, and just now we saw another man here at the fair who looks just like him. Oscar, is it? Are they brothers?" The older man looked up from his task, a polite but tired smile on his face. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Elias and Oscar. They're twins." "Twins?" Eleanor repeated, her breath catching. She exchanged a wild, incredulous glance with Arthur. "Their boys weren't twins. They were triplets." The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Well, actually, here's a fun little fact for you. Most folks don't know this, but they're actually triplets. The third one, Leo, he isn't here today, though. He's a bit quieter, prefers to stay back. He works mostly at Mr. Croft's private estate, not too far from the main sanctuary. Helps with the younger children there, the really little ones." Eleanor and Arthur stared at each other, identical expressions of sheer, unadulterated dread and a terrifying, burgeoning hope mingling on their faces. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the fair faded into a distant roar. "Triplets. Where is this private estate?" they asked, their voices merging into a single, urgent, breathless query. The older staff member gave them an odd look, clearly taken aback by their synchronized question and the sudden, almost desperate intensity in their eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, sir, but I can't really disclose Mr. Croft's private residence information. It's private." He fumbled in a box of pamphlets and handed them one. "Here's the main sanctuary address and our official contact information, if you'd like to know more about our programs and what we're doing for the community." "Yes, thank you," Arthur said, his voice strained as he took the brochure, though they already had the information. "We appreciate your time." They stepped away from the tent, moving automatically to a quiet, shadowed corner behind a livestock pen, the scent of hay and manure suddenly sharp and overwhelming. "Arthur," Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. "Triplets! He said they're triplets! And they're the right age. Elias said he's been with Croft since he was 6. Arthur ran a trembling hand through his already disheveled hair, his face a mask of stricken disbelief. It can't be a coincidence, Ellie. It just can't. The Cadillac in the photograph, Croft's strange reaction, his lies, and now these 3 men, triplets, who look so much alike, who are the right age. Our boys, Eleanor breathed, tears finally breaking free, hot and fast, streaming down her face. After all these years, oh Arthur, could we have finally found our boys? They rushed to the main parking lot, their eyes frantically scanning the rows of departing vehicles, searching for Croft's crimson Cadillac or the car Oscar might have arrived in. But they saw no sign of either man nor the distinctive vintage car. They were gone. Getting into their own car, Arthur started the engine with a decisive roar, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "We're going back to the sanctuary," he said firmly, his voice raw with a desperate resolve. "That's where they're most likely to go. Or at least, that's where we start." As they pulled out onto the road, leaving the chaotic remnants of the Wallowa County Fair behind them, Eleanor fumbled for her phone, her fingers slippery with a mixture of sweat and tears. With a trembling hand, she dialed 911, -1. 911, -1. "What is your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, a stark contrast to the maelstrom raging within Eleanor. I need to speak to a detective," Eleanor stammered, her voice cracking. "It's regarding a cold case, missing children, from Willow Creek, 1985, the Vance triplets." There was a brief pause, the rustle of a keyboard then. "Connecting you to the Wallowa County Sheriff's Department, ma'am. Please hold." Within moments, a new voice, gruff but not unkind, came on the line. "Detective Miller, Wallowa County Sheriff's. How can I help you?" "Detective Miller," Eleanor began, taking a deep, shuddering breath, Arthur's hand finding hers, a silent anchor. "This is going to sound incredible, unbelievable perhaps, but my husband and I, we believe we may have found our sons. Our 3 sons, who disappeared 30 years ago." She quickly, concisely recounted everything. The photograph with the crimson Cadillac. Finding Silas Croft, their former teacher, at his charity farm, Croft's sanctuary for new beginnings. The discovery of Elias and Oscar, 2 men who appeared to be identical, and the revelation from a staff member that they were, in fact, triplets, with a 3rd brother named Leo. "They look to be the right age, Detective. Our boys would be 36 now. And they have the same features. The same hair, the smiles. The man who we believe took them, Silas Croft, was their elementary school teacher. He left the fair in a hurry when we showed him the photograph and questioned him about his car. We're heading back to his sanctuary now." "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Vance," Detective Miller replied, his tone now laced with a cautious urgency. "But I need you to promise me you will not confront Mr. Croft or anyone at that sanctuary on your own. Do not even approach the property. Wait for my deputies. Silas Croft is a respected figure in this community, runs a significant charity operation. We need to handle this by the book. My team and I are heading to the sanctuary location you provided now. I've also contacted the state police for backup and to cross-reference your original case files from Willow Creek. They should have units in the vicinity within 20 minutes, perhaps less." "We're almost there," Arthur said, his voice tight, as he turned onto the long, dusty gravel road leading to Croft's sanctuary for new beginnings. "If you see Croft or his vehicle, maintain a safe distance," Detective Miller warned, his voice sharp. "The fact that he left the fair early with one of these men after your conversation is concerning. But we have to proceed carefully. Stay on the line with me." "We will," Eleanor promised, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phone pressed hard against her ear. They reached the turnoff to the sanctuary but, as instructed, parked well away from the main buildings, concealing their car behind a dense stand of pine trees where they could observe the entrance without being seen. Minutes ticked by, stretching into an eternity. There was no sign of movement, though a dusty pickup truck and a newer sedan remained parked near the farmhouse. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, 3 figures emerged from the main house. Silas Croft, flanked by Elias and Oscar. They moved quickly, purposefully, throwing duffel bags into the trunk of Croft's gleaming crimson Cadillac, which was now parked directly in front of the farmhouse. "They're leaving," Eleanor whispered urgently into the phone. Croft, Elias, and Oscar, they're all getting into the Cadillac. Stay where you are, Detective Miller instructed, his voice taut. We've pulled the property records for the sanctuary. It's registered under a shell corporation, not directly to Silas Croft. We're issuing warrants now to search both the sanctuary and a secondary private residence we've just located, also linked to that corporation. My deputies are 2 minutes out. As Croft's Cadillac began to pull away from the house, its powerful engine rumbling in the quiet afternoon air, 2 Wallowa County Sheriff's vehicles, lights suddenly flashing, sirens silent but imposing, appeared at the end of the gravel driveway. They quickly, expertly, positioned themselves to block the exit. "The sheriff's deputies are here," Eleanor reported, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and terror. "Good. Stay in your car until I tell you otherwise," the detective replied. Through their windshield, Eleanor and Arthur watched as 4 deputies, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons, approached Croft's vehicle. Croft stepped out, his hands raised slightly, his face a mask of bewildered indignation and anger. Elias and Oscar exited more slowly from the passenger side, their expressions a mixture of confusion and apprehension. One of the deputies, clearly the senior officer, spoke at length with Croft, who gestured emphatically, pointing towards the house, shaking his head, his voice carrying on the breeze in indignant spurts. The deputy seemed uncertain, glancing at his colleagues, then back at Croft. "I think the sheriff is hesitant," Arthur murmured, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Croft must have a very good reputation around here. He's probably spinning them some story." Indeed, they could hear fragments of the conversation, Croft's cultivated, reasonable tones drifting towards them. Complete misunderstanding. Respected member of the community, vital charity work. These fine young men are like sons to me. "I can't wait any longer," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice dangerously quiet. She dropped the phone into her purse, but left the line open. "They're going to believe him. They're going to let him go." Before Arthur could react, before he could utter a word of protest, she was out of the car, her feet hitting the gravel with a decisive crunch. She strode towards the group, her slight figure radiating an unexpected, formidable strength. Arthur, his heart lurching, scrambled out after her. "Silas Croft," Eleanor called out, her voice ringing clear and strong in the sudden silence, cutting through Croft's explanations. Everyone turned to look at them. Croft, Elias, Oscar, the deputies. Croft's expression darkened instantly when he recognized Eleanor and Arthur. "Ma'am, sir," one of the deputies said, stepping forward, holding up a placating hand. "Please return to your vehicle. We are handling this situation." Instead, Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out the faded photograph from 1985. She held it up high, her hand trembling but her gaze unwavering, fixed on Croft. "If you are even considering letting this man leave," she said, her voice resonating with 30 years of suppressed grief and righteous fury, "then let me show you something. Let me tell you who this man really is." She took a step closer, the photograph, a shield, and a weapon. "These are my sons, Ethan, Owen, and Liam Vance. They vanished without a trace from Willow Creek, Oregon, on the 13th of June, 1985, abducted from our front yard." She turned then, her gaze sweeping over Elias and Oscar, who stared at her. Then at the photograph, their expressions shifting rapidly from confusion to a dawning, horrified shock. "And here," Eleanor declared, her voice breaking but resolute, pointing a trembling finger first at Elias, then at Oscar. "Here are 2 of them, standing right in front of you, Ethan and Owen." Elias and Oscar moved closer, as if drawn by an invisible force, their eyes glued to the image of 3 identical little boys in green denim overalls, their arms around each other, grinning at a world that was about to betray them. That's us," Elias breathed, his voice a shocked whisper. He looked at Oscar, whose face was a mirror of his own stunned disbelief. With Leo." "Is there a third brother?" the senior deputy asked sharply, his attention now fully on Elias and Oscar, his earlier deference to Croft gone. Both young men nodded, still staring at the photograph as if it held the secrets of their very existence. "I did nothing wrong," Silas Croft insisted, his voice rising, cracking with a sudden, desperate panic. "I saved these boys. They were abandoned, neglected. I gave them a life." "These were my children," Eleanor cried, her voice raw with pain. "They were loved. They were cherished. They were not abandoned. They disappeared while playing outside our house one sunny afternoon. She pointed to the sliver of crimson at the edge of the photograph. That's your Cadillac in the background, isn't it, Silas? Parked just down the street from our home, the same crimson Cadillac you are trying to escape in right now. Croft remained silent, his jaw working, his face paling to a ghastly white. The Cadillac. It's in the main garage, near the farmhouse, Oscar said quietly, his gaze lifting from the photograph to meet Eleanor's. A flicker of something, memory, recognition, in his eyes. He still has it. He keeps it covered. Elias looked from Eleanor to Arthur, then back to Eleanor, his brow furrowed in a painful, dawning confusion. Are you really our parents?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Croft, Silas, he always told us you were criminals." "That you were in prison for life." "Yes," Eleanor and Arthur said in unison, tears streaming down Eleanor's face, Arthur's arm now firmly around her shoulders. "Yes, we are your parents, and we were never, ever in prison. That man," Eleanor choked out, pointing a shaking finger at Croft, "has been lying to you, to all of you, for your entire lives." She reached out a trembling hand towards Elias. "You've all grown so much, just as Arthur and I always prayed you would. So handsome." We're 36 years old now," Oscar said, as if trying to make sense of an impossible equation. "That's right," Eleanor confirmed, a sob escaping her. "You were born on the 15th of February, 1979, Ethan, Owen, and Liam Vance." The deputies exchanged grim, knowing glances. The senior officer stepped forward, his voice now hard and uncompromising. "Mr. Silas Croft, please turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are now under arrest, and you are our primary suspect in the 1985 kidnapping of Ethan, Owen, and Liam Vance." Chapter 8. A Fractured Dawn. As one deputy firmly handcuffed a protesting, then suddenly deflated, Silas Croft, another spoke urgently into his radio, confirming the imminent execution of the search warrant at Croft's private estate, the one the older staff member at the fair had mentioned, the place where Leo was. The once peaceful sanctuary, with its idyllic facade of hope and new beginnings, transformed into a maelstrom of official activity as more law enforcement vehicles, including state police cruisers, arrived, their lights painting flashing strokes of blue and red against the fading afternoon light. Forensic technicians in sterile white suits began to meticulously search the farmhouse, the barns, and the outbuildings. Detectives, including Detective Miller, who had arrived with the second wave, began to interview Elias and Oscar separately, gently guiding them through the fractured memories of their stolen childhoods. In the main garage, under a heavy canvas tarp, they found it. The crimson Cadillac, its paintwork still gleaming despite its age, unmistakably the same vehicle from Eleanor's 30-year-old photograph. In Silas Croft's meticulously organized office within the farmhouse, hidden in a locked drawer of his antique mahogany desk, they discovered the original 1985 Oregon license plate from the Cadillac, along with a cache of expertly forged documents, birth certificates, social security cards, school records, all bearing the false names of Elias, Oscar, and Leo Croft, along with fabricated backstories painting them as orphan brothers from a troubled immigrant family. They should be Ethan, Owen, and Liam, Eleanor told Detective Miller, her voice thick with emotion, as she watched an officer carefully bag a small, worn teddy bear found in a box labeled Boys' Early Mementos. "I know Elias is Ethan, because of that wide, infectious smile. He always had it. And Oscar, he must be Owen. Owen always had that incredible agility, that slightly slimmer build, and a more thoughtful, watchful nature. So, Leo. Leo must be our Liam, our Gabriel." She often used their middle names when thinking of them individually. "They're not even primarily Hispanic, though our family ancestry does include some distant Spanish heritage on my mother's side," Arthur added, his voice raspy, which is probably why they could, with some carefully constructed lies, pass as such, especially as young children in a new environment, told what to believe about themselves. When questioned gently by Detective Miller about their third brother, Leo, Elias explained, his voice still laced with disbelief, "Silas, Mr. Croft. He always kept Leo at his private house, The main residence, he called it, never at the sanctuary with us for long periods, especially as we got older. He said Leo was more sensitive. Leo takes care of the very youngest children there, mostly orphaned immigrant kids, or so we were told. He's very good with them. Silas told us we were rescued. Oscar added, his gaze distant, haunted. He said our real parents were dangerous people, involved in terrible things, that they'd been sent to prison for life and had abandoned us. We believed him. Why wouldn't we? We were so young when it happened, only 6. He was all we knew. What? What did he do to you boys? Detective Miller asked, his voice carefully neutral. Both Elias and Oscar looked profoundly uncomfortable, exchanging a quick, shadowed glance. Nothing. Nothing overtly bad. Not in the last 20 years, at least, Elias said finally, his gaze dropping to his hands. He expected absolute obedience, for us to do things exactly as he said, without question. He called it instilling discipline and gratitude. But our early childhood, after he took us, it was harsh, Oscar added quietly, his voice barely a whisper. He would discipline us often, for the smallest infractions. Sometimes he'd make us strip, and he would touch us in ways that felt strange, confusing. Then he would hit us with a thin rattan stick. He said it was the consequence for not listening, for being willfully disobedient or ungrateful. His voice broke. Now we understand what he really did. But for all those years, we genuinely believed we were so inherently bad, so flawed, that he had to treat us that way for our own good. That's what he made us believe, especially when we were little. He was very persuasive. Later that evening, as a bruised twilight settled over the Wallowa Mountains, casting long, eerie shadows across the sanctuary grounds, a call came through from the tactical team that had executed the warrant at Silas Croft's private residence, a secluded, sprawling property about 10 miles deeper into the wilderness. We found him, Leo, the officer on the radio reported, his voice crackling slightly. Along with 8 other children, ranging in age from approximately 4 to 10 years old. We're moving them all to Wallowa Memorial Hospital for immediate evaluation and care. Many appear frightened, malnourished, and deeply traumatized. And Leo? Eleanor asked anxiously, gripping Arthur's hand so tightly her knuckles ached. Our Liam, how is he? He's confused, very disoriented, but physically seems relatively well, considering, the officer replied. We've explained the situation to him as gently and briefly as possible. He, along with Elias and Oscar, will be reunited at the sheriff's station in Enterprise. We'll bring them together with you and your husband there. As true darkness fell, blanketing the remote Oregon landscape, Eleanor and Arthur were escorted to a sheriff's cruiser for the somber drive to the county seat. Elias and Oscar followed in separate vehicles, each accompanied by a detective. Eleanor reached for Arthur's hand as they drove away from the sanctuary, leaving behind the place that had been both a prison and a twisted, counterfeit home to their sons for 3 long, stolen decades. Our boys, she whispered, the words a fragile prayer against the encroaching night. We found our boys. The fluorescent lights of the Wallowa County Sheriff's Station cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Eleanor sat in a small, sterile interview room, a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee untouched before her. Detective Miller sat across the small table, a digital recording device whirring softly between them, as she recounted, yet again, the day her world had shattered 30 years ago. Our community in Willow Creek was very close back then, she explained, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice surprisingly steady despite the emotional hurricane raging within her. Everyone knew everyone. Mr. Croft, Silas. He was highly respected. He was the boys' favorite teacher. Sometimes he'd even drive children home from school events, with parental consent, of course. A different time. A more trusting time. She described that fateful June afternoon, the ordinary details of an ordinary day that had veered into an unimaginable nightmare. Arthur and I were both home, but we often let the children play outside by themselves in the front yard for short periods. The neighbors all knew them, watched out for them. We felt safe, so terribly, naively safe. Her voice caught. 1 minute they were there, their laughter echoing in the sunshine, and the next, they were just gone. Detective Miller nodded sympathetically, making brief notes. Mrs. Vance, we've interviewed Mr. Croft at length. Given his age, his apparent health conditions, and the overwhelming evidence, Mr. Croft seems to have decided to confess fully rather than fight the charges. He's cooperative in his own way. Eleanor straightened, her attention sharpening, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. What? What did he say? Why? Why our boys? He said he always felt a unique connection to the triplets, the detective relayed, flipping through his notes. That's the precise phrasing he used. That afternoon, the day before he was officially supposed to have left Willow Creek, he decided he wanted to take them with him. He lured them into his Cadillac by offering them ice cream and a special adventure drive. The boys, especially your Ethan, were apparently fascinated with that car. Ethan always loved cars, Eleanor whispered, a fresh wave of pain washing over her. Croft had planned the kidnapping meticulously, for some time in advance it seems, Detective Miller continued. He had already packed essentials, not just for himself, but for 3 small children. He had forged paperwork, enough to get them across county lines without raising immediate suspicion. He laid low for a while, then later returned to this part of Oregon, establishing the sanctuary and his private residence using a series of forged identities and shell corporations. He purchased the isolated properties with cash, untraceable funds, and built his nonprofit for migrant children as a cover, a way to normalize the presence of children who weren't his. But how could there have been no witnesses? Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. He had been brought into the room a few minutes earlier to hear the findings. No screams, no struggles that would have alerted anyone? To the boys, Mr. Croft was a trusted, beloved figure, the detective explained. Their favorite teacher, offering them ice cream and a ride in his fancy car, it wouldn't have seemed threatening, not initially. And as you said, Mrs. Vance, the triplets were known to wander within your block. Perhaps no one thought anything of seeing them get into a car with him. Exactly, Detective Miller confirmed. After the initial adventure, Croft began his manipulation. He told them their house was suddenly in danger, that their parents, you, were involved in something terrible, something criminal. Over time, he systematically brainwashed them. They were only 6 years old. They trusted him so completely, so implicitly, that it was relatively easy for him to twist their reality. Arthur took Eleanor's hand, his face a grim, anguished mask. He told the triplets they were actually orphaned immigrant children from a war-torn country. The detective continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion as he recounted the chilling details of Croft's confession. He convinced them that their adoptive parents, you, had hidden their true origins from them, that you had been living illegally in America, and that you both had finally been arrested and sent to prison for life. He gradually, systematically, indoctrinated them with these elaborate stories, even creating fabricated photo albums and documents to support his lies. He became their savior, their sole protector. So, the motive? The motive for kidnapping our sons? Was just some twisted fascination? Eleanor asked incredulously, the sheer banality of it, juxtaposed with the enormity of their loss, almost unbearable. Detective Miller's expression grew somber. We've delved into Croft's background. He lost his entire family, his wife and his own 6-year-old twin sons, in a devastating house fire in the early 1970s. It appears he suffered a profound psychological break, a schism from reality, though he managed to function outwardly, quite convincingly, in society for many years. Based on his statements and a preliminary psychological evaluation, he came to believe that certain children, special children, were somehow meant to be his. Replacements, perhaps? Especially those with strong emotional bonds, like twins or triplets. Eleanor closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples, trying to process the warped, selfish logic that had irrevocably stolen 3 decades from her family, from her sons. What happens now? Arthur asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion and a dawning, fragile hope. Croft will face multiple felony charges. 3 counts of kidnapping in the first degree, child abuse, false imprisonment, identity fraud, endangering the welfare of minors. The list is long, the detective stated. The younger children found at his private residence are currently being evaluated by Child Protective Services and medical professionals. We're working around the clock to identify them and, where possible, locate their families, or arrange for appropriate foster care. It's a complex situation. He stood, his chair scraping against the linoleum. But right now, I think there are 3 young men who have waited long enough to see you properly. He opened the door and spoke quietly to an officer stationed in the hallway. Moments later, the door reopened. Elias, Oscar, and a 3rd young man, Leo, her Liam, her Gabriel, his eyes slightly more almond-shaped, his build a fraction slighter, just as she remembered, stood hesitantly in the doorway. They were grown men now, 36 years old, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion, trepidation, and a dawning, bewildered hope. Yet, through the unfamiliar lines of adulthood, Eleanor could still see her little boys. Ethan's wide, ready smile, even now tinged with uncertainty. Owen's thoughtful, observant eyes, currently filled with a cautious curiosity. And Liam's quieter, more intense gaze, searching her face, searching Arthur's, as if trying to reconcile a dream with reality. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved, no one spoke. 30 years of separation, of silence, of stolen lives, hung between them like an invisible, almost unbearable wall. A lifetime of missed birthdays, school graduations, first loves, heartaches and triumphs, all condensed into this single, shattering moment. Then Eleanor rose from her chair, a strangled sob escaping her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish and overwhelming love. She took one uncertain step forward, then another. Arthur stood beside her, his arm around her waist, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. "My boys," Eleanor whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "My beautiful, beautiful boys." Something in her voice, in the raw, undeniable power of her maternal love, seemed to break through the wall of confusion and lies that had imprisoned them for 3 decades. Elias, Ethan, was the first to move, crossing the small room in 3 long, hesitant strides to enfold his mother in a hug that was both fierce and tentative. Oscar, Owen, and then Liam, followed immediately, their arms joining his, creating a circle of reunion. Arthur stepped forward, completing the embrace, his own arms wrapping around his sons, around his wife, holding them all together as if he was afraid they might dissolve, might disappear again. They stood there, 5 people clinging to each other, the harsh fluorescent light of the small-town police station illuminating their tear-streaked faces, as 3 decades of unspoken grief, of unimaginable loss, of carefully constructed lies, poured out in a silent, cleansing flood of emotion. "I never stopped looking for you," Eleanor sobbed, her hands moving from one son's face to another, touching their hair, their cheeks, relearning the contours that had changed from boy to man. "Not for one single day. Not for one single hour. We didn't know." Leo said softly, his voice thick with unshed tears, his head resting on her shoulder. We thought you were gone, that you didn't want us. But we're here now," Arthur said, his voice choked, his face buried in his son's hair. "We're all here now, together." Outside the interview room window, the night had deepened, the vast, indifferent Oregon sky spangled with distant, cold stars. Inside, under the stark, unforgiving lights, a family torn apart by one man's twisted obsession, by a grief that had curdled into madness, began the first tentative, painful, miraculous moments of healing, finally, impossibly, miraculously complete once more.